In February of 1926, the Ritz-Carlton Cloister Inn opened on a lagoon in Boca Raton, Florida, built for $1.75 million with furnishings running to $10,000 a room, the most expensive hotel of its size on Earth. 2 years before, that same stretch of scrubland between Palm Beach and Miami had carried roughly 100 residents, pineapple farmers, with no reason to expect visitors. It had no paved road. It had no hotel of any kind. It had no name beyond the county line. Today, Boca Raton is one of the wealthiest cities in Florida, and its street plan, its stucco skyline, its name recognition all trace back to those same 18 months of construction. A pineapple farm became a national address in under 2 years, and the pitch that built it was never designed to reach a finished city at all. Chapter 1. The Scrubland and the Paper. Spanish charts marked this stretch of Florida coast Boca de Ratons, a name meant for a rocky inlet somewhere near Biscayne Bay, 40 miles to the south. A map maker moved it north, and then another map maker copied the error, until the name had drifted from the inlet it described to a shoreline that had no rocks worth mentioning. There was no rat's mouth here, no harbor of any consequence. Only flat sand, pine, and palmetto scrub running between two better-known towns. The land had no government of its own. A post office would have been a waste of the paper. Nobody beyond the county line could have named the place if asked. Mosquitoes were the most dependable feature of the landscape. For 3 centuries after the Spanish first charted the coastline, nobody thought the ground underneath the borrowed name was worth a second look. Then Henry Flagler brought a railroad through it. His Florida East Coast line reached the area in 1895. Each laying steel rail across scrubland that had never carried more than a footpath, and for the first time, the ground had a way to send something to market. Japanese immigrants of the Yamato colony arrived around 1904 to farm it, clearing acreage for pineapples and shipping the fruit north in refrigerated cars behind Flagler's locomotives. The colony held on for 2 decades, planting and harvesting on land nobody else wanted badly enough to take from them, building a settlement that appeared on no postcard and drew no visitors. By the census of 1920, the entire community, farmers, families, the handful of merchants who served them, numbered barely more than 100 people. Then the money arrived. And the money had nothing to do with pineapples. Miami real estate prices were doubling within months in the early 1920s, driven by a national appetite for Florida sunshine and Florida paper. Pullman cars ran south loaded with buyers who had never set foot in the state. The nurse money, men who read about Florida in northern newspapers and boarded a train the same week. New highways carried automobiles down from Georgia and the Carolinas, full of men looking for a lot to flip before lunch. None of that money asked what the ground was for, or who was farming it, or what stood on it before the surveyors arrived. It asked only what the ground would be worth in 30 days. 30 days was, in fact, the unit the whole boom ran on. A buyer put down 10% of a lot's price and received a binder. A 30-day promise to complete the purchase, transferable, resellable, worth exactly as much as the next man would pay for it. Young men calling themselves binder boys worked the crowds outside land offices from Miami to West Palm Beach, buying binders in the morning and reselling the same paper by afternoon, again and again, before the original 30 days ran out. Nobody in that chain intended to build a house. Nobody intended to plant a lawn or dig a foundation or do anything at all with the dirt underneath. The lot itself barely mattered. The signature on it was the only thing gaining value. The paper was the product, and the paper only had to survive until the next buyer signed. By the middle of the decade, that current of paper profits was running straight through the old pineapple ground on the county line, through a farm town that still had no hotel, no paved street, and barely a name most buyers could spell correctly. The scrub was still scrub. Nobody had built anything on it yet. Not a house, not a road, not the grand hotel the name would eventually demand. And then, in the spring of 1925, two brothers out of Palm Beach decided that Current needed a destination. Chapter 2: The Architect and the Con Man. Addison Mizner was a California-born architect who had never finished a single day of formal architectural training and who never seemed troubled by the omission. He was born in 1872 in Benicia, a small port town on San Francisco Bay, the son of a diplomat who dragged the family through Guatemala and the rest of Central America on postings that gave young Addison his first look at Spanish colonial buildings rather than American ones. He picked up construction the way some men pick up a foreign language abroad, by watching, sketching, and asking questions nobody had authorized him to ask. By the time he reached Palm Beach, he carried no license, no degree, and no formal apprenticeship behind his name, only a portfolio of watercolors and an unusual gift for making very rich people believe he understood exactly what they wanted before they said it themselves. In 1918, he built the Everglades Club in Palm Beach, and it made him, almost overnight, the favorite architect of a resort aristocracy that had never before had a style it could call its own. Commissions followed without competitive bidding, without a licensing board asking questions, without anything resembling the scrutiny a formally trained architect might have faced. Addison's clients were not hiring a credential. They were hiring a taste, and the taste, by 1925, was worth more in Palm Beach than any diploma. That style had a name and a formula, and both traveled well. Pink stucco walls, barrel tile roofs, wrought iron balconies borrowed loosely from Spain, Italy, and whatever else Addison had sketched on his travels and reassembled from memory. Mediterranean Revival, as it would come to be called, became shorthand for a particular kind of American wealth, the kind that wanted to look old and Spanish rather than new and rich. Palm Beach's cottagers commissioned one villa after another in the style, and each commission made the next one easier to sell. Addison never gave them a reason to ask, west where the authenticity ended and the invention began. Enter Wilson Mizner, 4 years older than his brother and considerably harder to summarize in a single sentence. Wilson was a California-born playwright, veteran of the Klondike Gold Rush, professional gambler, and by most contemporary accounts, one of the most gifted con artists of his generation, a man who had talked his way through mining camps, prize-fight arenas, and Broadway dressing rooms before drifting into whatever venture happened to be paying at the time. He wrote for the stage. He managed prize fighters. He ran card games that other men remembered losing at for the rest of their lives. His reputation on both coasts was built on lines other people repeated for him, and on deals that always seemed to leave him a little richer than the man on the other side of the table. When his brother's Florida venture needed a treasurer, Wilson took the job, and nobody who had ever sat across a table from him should have been surprised. The brothers were, in the plainest possible terms, opposite instruments built for the same purpose. Addison supplied the dream, the watercolor renderings, the imported antiques, the sense that a stretch of Florida scrub could be made to look like it had always belonged to a Venetian doge. Wilson supplied the pitch, the charm that closed a sale before the buyer had time to ask what exactly he was buying. Addison wanted the world to believe in his taste. Wilson only needed it to believe long enough to sign. Between them, they had everything required to turn an idea into money and very little instinct for stopping once the money started moving. One brother built the picture, the other sold it. On the 15th of April, 1925, the Mizner Development Corporation would put both talents on public display at once. The announcement that day was of a kind that Florida, a state already well acquainted with ambitious announcements, had not quite seen before. Chapter 3: The Announcement. On the 15th of April, 1925, the Mizner Development Corporation released its plan for what the announcement itself called the Venice of the Atlantic, and the plan did not modestly undersell itself. A hotel of 1,000 rooms was promised on the lagoon, where the Cloister Inn would eventually rise at a fraction of that size. 2 golf courses came with it, laid out across ground that had grown nothing but pineapples 5 years earlier. So did a polo field, for a sport that required more horses than the entire county then owned. And at the center of the plan, wider than any street built to that point in the state of Florida, ran Camino Real. Camino Real was drawn at 160 feet across, a width that had no functional relationship to the traffic Boca Raton carried in 1925, since Boca Raton carried almost no traffic at all. Down the exact center of that width, the renderings showed a canal. Not a drainage ditch, an actual canal, lined in stone, wide enough for gondolas to pass 2 abreast, connecting the ocean to the planned hotel lagoon, so that a guest could step off a private rail car and finish the last quarter mile of the journey by water. The median that would carry that canal was surveyed and graded before a single gondola had been ordered from Italy. It ran the length of the boulevard as a bare strip of cleared earth reserved on paper for water that had not yet been asked to arrive. The corporation raised the money to build all of it by selling $5 million in stock, and the offering sold out in under a week. It sold quickly in part because of what was printed on the letterhead. T. Coleman DuPont, former United States Senator and chairman of the company that carried his family's name in gunpowder and chemicals, signed on as chairman of the board. Irving Berlin's name appeared among the backers. So did W.K. Vanderbilt II's. A buyer in New York who had never seen a pineapple field in his life could look at that letterhead and conclude, reasonably enough, that men of that stature would not attach themselves to Scrubland. That conclusion was the entire strategy, and Harry Reichenbach had been hired to manufacture it. Reichenbach was a publicity man out of New York, already known for stunts that put invented stories into real newspapers, and his instruction to the sales force at Boca Raton was specific: work the names into every pitch, before the acreage, before the price, before the golf courses. A salesman was not selling a lot on a canal that did not exist yet. He was selling proximity to DuPont, to Berlin, to Vanderbilt. The land was the delivery mechanism. The names were the product. On the first day lots went on sale, the company took in more than $2 million. The farm town that had counted barely 100 residents in the 1920 census could not process what its own success required. Builders and salesmen arrived by the trainload through that spring, and within months the population passed 2,000, 20 times what it had been, in a town that still had no bank of its own, no hospital, and that April, no legal government at all. Boca Raton acquired that government in May of 1925, when the town formally incorporated. The company that had sold the lots now held a seat at the table that would zone them. Nothing about the arrangement had changed since April 15th. It had only become official. The money was arriving faster than the company could spend it in cash, which was, in its own way, a problem the Mizners were already solving, by buying their way onto the boards of the banks that held it. Chapter 4. The Paper and the Stucco. A bank in Boca Raton in 1925 was, structurally, a small and useful machine. It took deposits from binder boys and lot buyers passing through on their way to close a sale, and it made loans to whoever needed capital to keep building on land that had, in most cases, not yet produced a foundation. The Mizners understood this machine well enough to want to own it, rather than simply borrow from it. Wilson and Addison, along with the corporation's inner circle, bought controlling stock in the local banks already holding the company's deposits. Once the stock was theirs, the company borrowed from those same banks, capital raised against collateral that the bank's own directors, who now sat on Mizner Development's board, had every reason to value generously. The men approving the loans and the men receiving them were men. By the autumn of 1925, frequently the same men in different chairs. No single transaction in the arrangement was, on its own, irregular. The corporation borrowed. The bank lent. The paperwork was in order. What the arrangement removed, methodically and by design, was the one thing a lender is supposed to provide: distance. Downstream from the banks, the same removal of distance was happening lot by lot. A buyer in New York, a dentist, a widow, a retired grocer, the kind of northern money the boom ran on, would put down a deposit on a lot he had never seen, holding nothing but a plat map and a stack of Addison's watercolor renderings showing a canal, a hotel, a polo field that did not yet exist in any form but ink. Before the first installment came due, the same lot would change hands again at a price that had, in some cases, doubled. The buyer paying the higher price had seen exactly as much of the actual ground as the buyer before him. Nothing. Nobody in that resale chain was buying land. They were buying the next man's willingness to pay more than they had. The cash sitting in the company's accounts by the end of the year was not rent or crop revenue or hotel receipts. It was commissions on paper collected faster than the city could be poured in concrete. The renderings were the only city that existed at full scale. Some of it, though, was real. On the lagoon, the Cloister Inn rose through the last months of 1925 in true stucco and true barrel tile, Addison's Spanish antiques already crated and shipped south to furnish rooms that had a roof over them. 29 houses went up in Old Floresta, built for the company's own executives and its better-paying buyers, each one a compressed version of Addison's Mediterranean formula: arches, tile, wrought iron, the same vocabulary scaled down from resort to residence. On Camino Real itself, the administration buildings rose among the first finished structures, small Mediterranean palaces, built not to house anyone, but to sell the dream in person. Rooms where a buyer could stand under a real tile roof and sign for a lot he would never see. These were not showpieces raised after the fact. They were built first because a rendering can sell a stranger in New York, but a man standing on the ground wants stucco under his hand. Camino Real itself told the same story in its own dimensions. Graded and paved to its full 160 feet for the better part of a mile, the boulevard ran wide enough for the city the company kept promising. And then it stopped, the pavement narrowing back into raw scrub, the median beside it cleared, and waiting for a canal that had never been dug and no gondola had ever floated on. A visitor could drive the finished stretch and believe, for that mile, that the Venice of the Atlantic was arriving on schedule. The scrub at the end of it told a different, quieter story, one the sales office left out of the pitch. By October, the company's chairman had begun doing his own arithmetic on the distance between the picture and the ground. What Coleman DuPont decided to do about it became public before the year was out. Chapter 5. Names, Rails, Water. On October 24, 1925, T. Coleman DuPont resigned as chairman of the Mizner Development Corporation, and he did not resign quietly. The New York Times carried his statement the following morning, and it described what industry reporters were already calling a nasty split between the chairman and the men still running the company's advertising. DuPont's complaint was specific and unflattering. His name and the names of the other prominent men on the letterhead were being sold to buyers as a guarantee the corporation had no intention of honoring. He had lent his name to a hotel, 2 golf courses, and a canal that was still a bare median strip of cleared earth. He had not lent it to every claim a copywriter cared to print beneath it. The resignation did what a single resignation rarely does on its own. Attorneys representing the corporation's other celebrated directors began circulating a warning through the same channels the sales force had once used to circulate names. A director whose signature appeared on advertising copy could be held personally liable if that copy turned out to be false. It was a narrow legal point, and it was enough. Within weeks, more resignations followed, each one reported in smaller type than DuPont's, but read with the same attention by buyers who had purchased binders on the strength of exactly those signatures. The corporation had never manufactured a product. It had manufactured confidence, packaged under famous names. And confidence was now doing what confidence does once the men attached to it start walking away from it in public. It was leaking, and there was no crew assigned to patch it. That same autumn, before the resignations had finished working through the newspapers, the Florida East Coast Railway announced an embargo on construction freight. The line Henry Flagler had built through the scrub 30 years earlier still ran on a single track for most of its length, built for the freight volume of a farm coast, not for a peninsula trying to build a dozen Venices at once. Lumber, cement, tile, and structural steel bound for Boca Raton and every other boomtown south of Jacksonville backed up in freight yards that had no capacity to move it. The railroad had not chosen to strangle the boom. It simply could not carry it. The materials sat in Jacksonville, on flat cars and in warehouses waiting for track that did not exist. Then, on January 10, 1926, the schooner Prince Valdemar rolled onto its side in the main channel of Miami Harbor while being towed to her mooring and settled there, hull up, blocking the only deep-water passage into the port for weeks. Ships carrying the freight the railroad could no longer move sat outside the harbor with nowhere to unload it. The channel that had once been Boca Raton's alternate route around a bottlenecked railway was now itself the bottleneck. The names went quiet. The rails went quiet. The harbor went quiet. 3 separate systems, none of them built to fail at the same time, failed within 10 weeks of each other. The credibility that had sold the lots, the railroad that had promised to deliver the city, and the water route that was supposed to carry what the railroad could not. None of it arrived as a single catastrophe. Each piece simply stopped functioning in its own register on its own schedule, while the sales office kept writing up new lots through all of it. In Boca Raton, none of that stopped the work already underway on the lagoon. Through January, crews were still setting tile in the Cloister Inn's dining room and hanging the last of Addison's imported ironwork above its doors. The invitations for the hotel's opening gala had already gone out. Chapter 6. The High Water Mark. The invitations that had gone out in January came due in February, and the guests who answered them found a hotel that, on paper, had not existed at all 20 months earlier. Picture Camino Real on a February evening in 1926. The boulevard lit end-to-end for the first time since it had been graded out of the scrub. Electric lamps running the full mile, the pavement covered before the median gave way to raw sand. Private rail cars come in over Flagler's line, the same single track that had spent the previous autumn choked on lumber and cement, carrying passengers instead of freight for one night. Bankers down from New York, cottagers over from Palm Beach, correspondents who had filed stories on DuPont's resignation in October and now filed a lighter one entirely. Dinner is served in the Cloister Inn's dining room on Addison's own Spanish antiques, refectory tables, iron sconces, choir stalls he had been collecting out of Seville and Granada for a decade before he ever drew a line for Boca Raton. Light falls through the barrel tile arches onto a room built to look 400 years older than it was. An orchestra plays under those arches, the sound carrying out over a lagoon that no gondola had crossed and none ever would. Somewhere in the room, the number every guest had already read in a brochure gets said aloud once more. $10,000 a room, in furnishings alone, the most expensive hotel of its size on Earth. And for one evening, the number does exactly the work it was built to do. It is the high water mark of the entire venture. The one night the Venice of the Atlantic looked, briefly, like a finished city rather than a rendering. Coleman Dupont was not among the guests. He had put his objections in the Times 4 months earlier, and had not come back to see how the story ended. Most of the directors who resigned alongside him stayed away too, and so did the gondola, and the polo field, and the second golf course. 29 houses stood finished in Old Floresta that winter, sold to buyers who had signed for them on paper and never once seen the tile roofs go up over their own names. The harbor at Miami had only just reopened after weeks sealed by an overturned schooner, and the railroad embargo behind it had never fully lifted. None of that showed in the dining room that night. The tide had already turned. The party just hadn't been told yet. By spring, the current running through South Florida's land offices reversed. Binder boys who had resold the same lot 5 and 6 times across 1925 found no buyer waiting to take the paper at the next markup. And a binder unclaimed at 30 days was a binder in default. Defaults spread up the resale chain the same way the profits once had, lot by lot, each failure erasing the sale that had financed the one before it. Mizner Development's incoming cash had never been rent or hotel revenue. It was commissions on that chain, and the chain was now running backward. The $2 million taken in on the first day of lot sales had already gone into stucco walls and imported tile, not into the streets those first buyers had been promised. The company still owed a 1,000-room hotel it had built to a fraction of that size, 2 golf courses it had built to half of one, and a canal down the center of Camino Real that remained exactly what it had been since the surveyors marked it. A graded strip of cleared earth, waiting for water nobody had ordered. Nothing about the unraveling announced itself as final. Sales thinned the way a tide goes out, a little further each week, easy to miss from inside a dining room where the orchestra was still booked through March. The reckoning would not come from a ledger or a courtroom. It would come that September, from 200 miles out over the open Atlantic, where something nobody in Boca Raton yet had reason to watch was only beginning to gather. Chapter 7. The Storm South of Miami. At 6 in the morning on September 18, 1926, a hurricane came ashore on the coast south of Miami, its center crossing land somewhere between Coral Gables and South Miami, with sustained winds recorded near 125 miles per hour and a barometric pressure that set a record for the region at landfall. It was a Category 4 storm, the strongest to strike South Florida since instrument records began there. The eye passed directly over the built-up shoreline, and for roughly 35 minutes the wind stopped and the sky cleared. And thousands of residents who had never lived through a hurricane before walked outside to survey the damage, believing the storm had already passed. It had not passed. The back wall of the eye arrived within the hour, wind now driving from the opposite direction, against houses and crowds that had no warning beyond what the first half of the storm should have taught them. At least 372 people were killed. Some estimates from the period run higher, since migrant laborers in the farm camps south of the city were never fully entered into the official count. Tens of thousands were left without shelter. 3 weeks earlier, in that same region, shelter had been the fastest-selling commodity in the United States. The boom that had carried Boca Raton from a farm stop to a name on northern letterhead ended that night, and it ended without a second act. Lot sales across South Florida, already thinning since spring, did not merely slow after September 18th. They stopped because the storm had destroyed the one asset the entire market ran on, the belief that Florida land would be worth more tomorrow than it was worth today. South Florida fell into a regional depression within weeks of the hurricane, 3 years ahead of the stock market crash that would eventually pull the rest of the country down with it. The binder boys had nothing left to resell. The Pullman cars stopped arriving full, Boca Raton itself took comparatively little structural damage. The Cloister Inn's tile roof held. The administration buildings on Camino Real stood undamaged, and the boulevard's mile of finished pavement was still there the next morning, running out into the same scrub it had always stopped at. What the storm destroyed in Boca Raton was not brick or tile. It was the buyer. The men and women who had signed for lots on the strength of a rendering and a famous name on a letterhead no longer existed as a market. Not because they had died in the storm, most of them 1,000 miles away in New York and Ohio, but because the story that had moved them to sign was no longer one any newspaper in the country cared to print. A watercolor could not compete with a wire photo of a ruined waterfront. By the spring of 1927, the lawsuits arrived. Investors who had paid for lots on the promise of a hotel wing, a golf course, or a canal that had never been dug filed to recover their money, and a Florida court, hearing claim after claim against a company that could meet none of them, appointed 3 bankruptcy trustees to take control of what remained of Mizner development. The trustees inherited a half-built Venice, a hotel, a fraction of its promised size, 2 golf courses that had never been finished into one, and a median strip on Camino Real, still waiting for water that had never been ordered. In November of 1927, Clarence H. Geist arrived to settle the estate. Geist was a Philadelphia utilities magnate, a gas man who had built his fortune consolidating smaller companies into larger ones, and he had been among the original backers of the Mizner venture 2.5 years earlier. He bought the entire operation, the Cloister Inn, the administration buildings, the graded boulevard, the unsold acreage, the name itself, for $71,500 in cash, plus the assumption of roughly $7 million in the company's outstanding debts. The resort, once advertised as the finest of its size on earth, changed hands for less than the cost of one of the private mansions Geist was already planning to build on its grounds. Addison Mizner was, by then, no longer in Boca Raton to see any of it happen. Neither was his brother. Chapter 8. What was left of the Mizners. Addison Mizner went back to Palm Beach, to the same stretch of coast where the Everglades Club had once made him the resort aristocracy's favorite name. There was no boom left to build for. The commissions that had come to him for a decade without a competitive bid, on the strength of taste alone, stopped arriving the same season the lot sales did, and nothing replaced them. He kept a smaller office on Worth Avenue. He sketched smaller houses for a smaller list of clients, men who could still afford Mediterranean revival but no longer in the quantities of 1925, and he sold off pieces of his own collection of Spanish antiques to cover what the office could not. On February 5, 1933, Addison Mizner died in Palm Beach, nearly broke, a decade after inventing the most imitated architectural style in South Florida, and 2 years after the town he had built ran out of buyers. Wilson Mizner had already left. By 1927, he was in Hollywood under contract to Warner Brothers, writing dialogue for gangster pictures with the same ear for a closing line that had once sold lots in Boca Raton nobody had ever seen. Nobody in Hollywood asked him to make good on any of it. Not the canal, not the golf course, not the 1,000-room hotel. He died 2 months after his brother, in a city 3,000 miles from the scrubland that had made and then unmade both of them. Somewhere between the 2 deaths were the buyers who had never gotten either brother on the telephone. Small investors from Ohio, from New England, men and women who had put a deposit down on a lot they had seen only in a watercolor and a famous name on a letterhead, were still holding binders and canceled stock certificates in 1933, with no court left to sue and no company left standing to answer them. Some had borrowed against a house to make the down payment. Nobody compiled a total of what was lost that way. Across how many states or to whom? Nobody was required to. In 1930, Clarence Geist reopened the Cloister Inn as the Boca Raton Club, spending close to $8 million to expand a hotel that had once gone bankrupt, trying to be a public resort into something that was never intended to be public at all. Membership ran to several hundred, admitted by invitation only, screened at the gate. The lagoon Addison had built for passing tourists now reserved for a client list smaller than the passenger manifest of a single Pullman car. The 1,000-room hotel had never been built. Geist did not need 1,000 rooms. He needed several hundred names, and by 1930 he already had them. By then, the town around the club numbered only a few hundred permanent residents, and through the years that followed, while the rest of the country stood in relief lines, most of that population drew its paycheck from a single address. Gardeners kept Geist's grounds, maids kept his rooms, caddies carried his members' clubs across fairways that had once been drawn, on paper, for a course twice their size. A city sold to the nation as a playground for 1,000 millionaires had survived the Depression as the household staff of one. The club's gates stayed shut to outsiders for the next decade, private and unremarkable from the road. Within a few years, the United States Army would come looking for exactly that kind of privacy, and for a very different reason. Chapter 9. The Unfinished Canal. The Army found what it needed in Boca Raton within months of Pearl Harbor. The town offered flat open land, a coastline for testing, and a population small enough that a few thousand uniformed strangers would draw no particular notice. In 1942, the Army Air Corps opened Boca Raton Army Airfield and made it the only radar training school the Army Air Forces operated anywhere in the country for the duration of the war. Officers and flight crews cycled through by the thousand, trained in equipment the government still classified, on scrubland that 18 years earlier had been sold to strangers as a Venetian fantasy. Clarence Geist's guarded resort, the club built to keep outsiders off the grounds, was requisitioned to house officers for the war's duration. The gate that had kept the public out for a decade did nothing to stop the Army. When the war ended, the base did not simply close. It split in two. The runways became, with almost no alteration, the Boca Raton Airport, still operating from the same ground today. The barracks land to the north was handed over for an entirely different purpose. It became the campus of Florida Atlantic University, built on acreage the Army had already cleared and graded for a war that no longer needed it. In 1956, Arthur Vining Davis came to finish what the Mizners had abandoned. Davis was chairman of the Aluminum Company of America and one of the wealthiest men in the country. And the corporation he founded that year, Arvida, had no interest in polo fields or painted canals. Arvida bought up the acreage the collapse had left scattered across Boca Raton, land that had existed for 30 years only as plat lines and watercolor renderings, and converted it parcel by parcel into the one thing the original scheme had never actually required: houses, for people who meant to live in them year-round. Arvida kept buying quietly through the next decade, and by 1965, the company had assembled several hundred acres on the town's western edge for a client that had not yet been named publicly. IBM opened a research and manufacturing campus on that ground in 1967. In August of 1981, a small team working inside it shipped the IBM personal computer, the machine that would define how an entire generation kept its records and did its work. A town sold to the country on renderings of a Venetian canal had become, by way of a corporation founded to clean up its own wreckage, the birthplace of the personal computer. Boca Raton today holds a population near 100,000 and ranks among the wealthiest cities in Florida. Its building code still requires pink stucco walls, barrel tile roofs, and the arched loggias Addison Mizner sketched from memory in 1925. Written into municipal law now, an aesthetic obligation rather than a suggestion. The city's own downtown shopping district carries his family's name. Mizner Park stands on ground his corporation once owned and lost, honoring, in its signage and its street name, a man whose company went bankrupt selling the town a picture of itself it never finished paying for. The Cloister Inn's original wing still stands, folded now inside the walls of a much larger resort that grew up around it decade by decade, the barrel tile and the wrought iron still visible under everything built onto it since. The administration buildings still stand on Camino Real too, small and Mediterranean and largely unchanged. The same rooms where strangers once signed for lots they had never seen and never would. The median is still there down the center of the boulevard, 160 feet wide, exactly where the plans called for a canal. Grass covers it now, mowed on a city schedule, palms set along its length at even intervals, sprinklers running before dawn. It is the most carefully tended strip of lawn in Boca Raton, kept with a precision that an actual canal would never have demanded of anyone. No water was ever put into it. None ever came.